I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book A Line in the Sand, no other than Mr. Miles Spencer. Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Miles, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Hey, Daniel. Um, Thanks for having me on the program. Boy, that's an awful lot of music in the background. Is that me or is that you?
It's me.
That's you. So no problem. I guess I would introduce myself as a father first. I have a couple of young kids that are quite an adventure in and of themselves. But I also have a curiosity for the world around us, and I try to teach them about that. But I've been adventuring together with my co-author Wells Jones for 25 years. And this book that we're going to talk about is actually the result of an adventure we took in the Middle East, Saudi, Jordan, and Syria. Although we took that original trek 15 years ago, we only recently wrote the book after the recent unrest in the Middle East after October 7th. And that continues today. So the book remains relevant and sells very well, interestingly enough, in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, as well, of course, in the United States. So I'm really pleased to be on your podcast and get to talk to your audience, Daniel.
Yes, Mr. Miles Spencer. Thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world. And what does the title A Line in the Sun symbolize in the context of the novel?
Daniel, what it really symbolizes is that the Middle East has been caught up in the last 100 years by um, basically colonials based in London and in France. I'm referring, of course, to Sykes and Picot, who put together the famous Sykes Picot Agreement that actually drew lines in the geography of the Middle East that we more or less today know. There was no Iraq back then, it was Mesopotamia. There was no Iran, it was Persia. There was no Jordan, actually. That was a given name. There was no Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That was a collection of 100 different tribes on the Arabian Peninsula. And the Levant, as they knew it back then, is now called Lebanon and Syria, including parts of Jordan. And then there's an area that at the time was called Palestine. That's much debated today. We'll call it Israel and Jordan together represents. But all of those countries and all of those borders were lines in the sand that were drawn by people in Europe.
So, Mr. Miles, how does the story explore the concept of boundaries, both literal and metaphorical?
That's a great question, Daniel. So those boundaries, first literal ones. What was amazing to Wells and I was that there are people there called Bedouins, tribesmen, that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years and perhaps relied on a water well, a source of food for their livestock, which suddenly, after these lines were drawn in the sand and borders were made, they were not able to cross and had those resources taken away from them. I'll give you a modern day example, which would be uh, some students that we met that were going to the university there in Jerusalem, but they were coming from the other side of the wall. Now, before that wall had been erected, it was a 5 minute walk to school and 5 minutes home, leaving plenty of time for homework, I would imagine. But with the border crossing instituted and the security checks that they had to go through, their average trip to school was 2 to 3 hours each way. So can you imagine giving up 4 to 6 hours of your day, certainly simply going through security checks in order to get to the university, and then maintaining a grade versus other students that may still have a 5 minute walk? Those are two physical examples of those boundaries and how they affected people. I hadn't been asked the question before of how the metaphysical or philosophical boundaries affected people, but I'll give that one a try. So I think that one thing that Americans perhaps don't know as well about the culture there is that by definition they're called Bedouin, and Bedouin means wanderers. And so their culture is not one of having a particular country and a particular flag and a particular alliance, because they would go where they could graze, where they could access water, uh, but they never set boundaries for others because they didn't have them themselves. And so, because of that, perhaps um, first the Ottoman Turks for 600 years ruled over them because they had the military equipment to do so, and the military might to do so. But those Bedouins never set boundaries for themselves of this is my land and this is your land. And eventually, obviously, it led to trouble, not just with the Ottoman Turks, but with the aftermath of the First World War, which was the Paris Peace Conference and the agreements that came from that. So, to a certain extent, I guess in this example, um, the the Arabs before there were Arab states were not in the habit of setting boundaries, and to a certain extent, they were taken advantage of because of said.
Very well said, Mr. Miles. Very well said. And what is the central conflict that drives the plot?
I would say the center conflict that drives the plot at the end of the day is the lack of understanding of the Western world for the culture, the geopolitics, the resources, the cuisines of the Middle East. And so the two protagonists, Magnus and Finn, and the two proteges that they have, Jeremy and Abdu, um, are discovering things about these lands through these artifacts that they're given by one of the grandmothers, who happens to be a great cook, by the way. But these artifacts give them small clues that allow them to unearth little bits of understanding of how the culture is driven and how the civilization is driven there. So the central plot is one of gradual understanding, which then they share those stories with others, which you're helping me share today, as a matter of fact. So that really is the central through line of the book. But there's quite a bit of adventure that surrounds it. There's a bit of storytelling. There's some delicious meals. There's wonderful recipes. And there's three grandmothers that forward the plot in interesting ways as well.
That'd be awesome. So, how does the setting influence the mood and direction of the story?
I think the setting is very important. I'm going to use the phrase, I think it's Arthur Conan Doyle, talked about the stranger in a strange land and describing a place that, again, most Westerners, most of our readers probably have not been before. Most people from the United States that have the opportunity to visit the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia either do it with a rifle on their back or a consulting contract with Aramco, the oil company. So a significant number of the people that have the opportunity to visit there, at least until 10 years ago, had those two designations. But it's beginning to open up now. And when we were there, what we saw with our own eyes was some amazing landscapes. Almost, I recall an area of desert called Wadi Rum. It's on the Saudi Jordan border. And interestingly enough, I learned later that the movie Dune was filmed there, as was certain um, of the battle scenes in the desert from Star Wars. It is vast, it's beautiful in its own way. There are
Yes.
colors there that you would never see anywhere else, whether that's the blue of the sky or the red of the sands. There is not a lot of green, but they specialize in earth tones, and we do our best to describe that in minute detail in the book so that the reader can actually place themselves there and begin to understand their surroundings before they get into the story.
What genre does the novel primarily fall into?
Well, that was a difficult one, Daniel. I wasn't sure how to tag it, but we call it historical fiction. So we write about actual events that happened in history. And this would be the Balfour Agreement, the uh, Weitzman-Faisal Agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And those are very specific to 1917 to 1919, the Arab Revolt um, uh, during the First World War. And so that fiction is, we're not historians, but we love history and we love to use stories to illustrate history. So that history is as true and honest as we could make it. But it is fiction because in order to get back and forth between 2006 and 1918, Magnus and Finn, the two protagonists, have a time travel device. And they use that occasionally in order to get back and experience with their own eyes what happened in 1918 and how that informed our present today. And believe me, we are living through it still 100 years later.
Yes, totally agree. So, Mr. Miles, can you tell us the research process of your historical fiction novel?
Mm, Well, I would say the first part of the research was actually going there and putting our feet in the sand, learning how to ride camel, learning how to endure the heat, um, learning how to enjoy the food. So our first research was not in a library or not on the internet. It was with our own eyes and ears and our feet in the sand. We spent 26 days trekking. That's horse and camel and foot and jeep for support through approximately 1,100 miles of track from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to Damascus, Syria. So that's the big number one in terms of the research. In terms of the history, there are wonderful books on a gentleman, obviously, by the name of T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia, from the famous movie. And I, I would estimate that Wells and I are probably 25 to 30 books deep in researching Lawrence and the stories that he told. The, the ultimate of that group is his book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which set about the guidelines or the route for the trek that we took. Um, so we did have the benefit of uh, at least a decade of researching and thinking about this, including the trips. And then the writing process between became fairly quick and efficient because we had been thinking about it for 15 years.
So, Mr. Miles, what is your advice for those aspiring writers out there want to write historical fiction like yours?
Well, I'm not a professional writer. I don't consider myself as one, but I will say this. The best advice I could give is start writing. and get into the process of that diligence every day of putting something out. Um, and that was step one. The way I write is I try to get the arc of the story. I try to start at least knowing the ending, or perhaps at least knowing the middle, a critical juncture in the book. And I try to write that chapter as fully and as cleanly as I can, and then work backwards and forwards from there. So, my best advice is start writing, it'll get better.
Yes, 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 people, start writing and stop procrastinating. If you have the passion to write, write, and share to the world. What is your short-term and long-term goals in writing, Mr. Miles?
Well, in the short term, I try to write 500,000 words every day, 5 days a week. That could be my blog, that could be future books, but just committing pen to paper is really important. I say pen to paper, but I don't use pens and I don't use paper. But my long term goals is to use Magnuson Finn and this idea of the imperial gaze of the colonials, um, to bring about stories from other strange lands that perhaps Westerners don't know about. Next up is Havana, Cuba, and hopefully that'll be out in March.
That'd be awesome. And good luck to your goals, Mr. Miles. And how does the novel use tension and suspense to engage the reader?
Well, um, I'll give a few examples, perhaps. There was a border crossing which, after 26 days in Saudi, Jordan, and Syria, we circled back through Jordan, crossed the King Hussein Bridge, which is in the northern part of Israel. And we rode together in a bus of 40 other Palestinians. That same experience of border crossings that I described earlier, we experienced it ourselves. The crossing took an hour and a half to clear security. Our inspection and interrogation was probably half of that. And the detail of the questions they asked, especially pertaining to two Americans with just backpacks wandering around the Middle East, while at the time there was a Syrian civil war breaking out. Iraq had just calmed down. Not many people went to Saudi Arabia. Why are you here in Israel? Was asked to us 20 different times in 20 different ways. It was not comfortable at all. And ironically, it was with an ally of the United States asking the questions. Um, but I think it's important there to describe how we felt, because we felt it ourselves, and that built the tension in the book. But it's in the personal descriptions of how those actions affected us, both in the present and um, throughout the rest of our lives.
So, Mr. Miles, to sum up our episode for today, are there any plot twists or unexpected revelations that redefine the story direction without spoilers?
Well, um, very much so. I think there's at least one a chapter. And again, I won't spoil them, but once you think you understand description of uh, uh, a, uh, a swimming hole in Jordan, or a religious site in Saudi Arabia, or a tour of Jerusalem from a guide, in almost every chapter, it doesn't end the way you think it will when you begin. And the last bit of the book, um, delivers in spades in terms of a plot twist and a surprise. Please don't read the last page first.
Mr. Miles Spencer, again, thank you so much for bringing your historical fiction to the world. We are looking forward for more historical fiction novels to come. So, Mr. Miles, can you please invite our listeners to support your novel?
Sure, absolutely. You can go to Amazon and order it either as a book, as Kindle, or as Audible, which is a wonderful narration by Eduardo Ballerini.
Yes, people. Let's support Mr. Miles Spencer because if you support him, as I said, more historical novels to come. So, Mr. Miles, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
More to come, people. See you soon. Okay, Mr. Miles, you are most welcome to come back if you have